All right, everyone, we've been talking about social structure and what we mean by social structure. One of the things that I want us to think about is the different forms or kinds of social structure that we can think of. Sociologists talk about social structure to mean these sort of external things that are outside of individuals that organize and are arranged in particular ways and define our lives, right? But we need to understand exactly the different ways that we could imagine, or the different ways that sociologists talk through what exactly we mean when we talk about these different social structures. So in this video, we're going to talk about 4 different ways of thinking about social structure. You shouldn't see these as kind of incompatible. They can operate together, and in some ways, they can influence and shape each other in different ways as well. Sometimes they could be different particular ways of thinking about them could be incompatible, but let's just think for a few minutes about what these different ways of defining social structure or thinking about social structure are, because we're going to get into actually talking through each of these different forms in greater detail as the weeks go on. So there's as I said, 4 basic kinds of social structure. The first way we can think about social structure is to think about social institutions. So when sociologists talk about social institutions, what we're really talking about are these kind of durable features of society that are guided by a set of rules, formal and informal norms that define what goes on within a particular sphere of human activity. And so in thinking about social institutions that way, we can begin to think about different kinds of social institutions that are out there. To think about the economy as a social institution, as we will in this course, and ask, okay, what are the set of rules that define what goes on within the economy? We can think about the family as a social institution, and what are the rules that govern who belongs in families, what kinds of forms families can take, what kinds of relationships define those families, and how those families' relationships are organized. We can think, and this takes us back to thinking about social positions and social roles, right? I mean, what does it mean to be a parent? What does it mean to be a child? We can think about religion or politics, education as social institutions. And in doing that, what we're thinking about is all of those different rules that are governing what goes on with this particular sphere of human activity. So social institutions is one way to think about social structure. Another is to think about social networks. And this is exactly the way that it sounds, the way that we're networked to each other, these sort of connections that we have and interrelations that we have amongst a particular group of people in some sort of defined sphere, right? So we can think about how it is that people are connected to us. And and we can think, in one sense, you may be thinking, okay, I'm thinking about who I'm friends with. But you can also think about not just who you're friends with, but who your friends are friends with. Right, these sort of second-order connections or ties that can end up shaping what kinds of things you know and how you think about the world. We can also, in this way, talk about social networks not just between people, but between other units of analysis, between organizations. We can think about social networks between countries or nation states. We can think about social relationships or social networks between families. Right, so we can think not just about interconnections between individual people, but we can think about connections between other kinds of social entities as well. A third way to think about social structure is to think about culture. And when sociologists talk about culture, what we're talking about are these different, you can think of it as shared ways of being, right? Ways of thinking, believing, and doing things, different kind of patterns and understandings of the world. We can also think about shared symbols or material objects, things that you could think, for example, about in the U.S., about the U.S. flag as a shared symbol that has particular meaning behind it that we understand. Now, very often, this involves a set of rituals that kind of reinforce and re-ingrain what those shared ways of being are all about. So if you think about religion, involves lots of religious communities involve lots of explicit kinds of rituals that reinscribe and redefine those particular shared understandings of the world, shared ways of doing things, and build community out of those cultures, out of those rituals. Now, very often, though, these things operate behind our backs. It's the kind of backdrop, the taken for granted aspects of the world that we don't even see and realize are a central part of holding us together until we're moved into another social setting where those shared understandings, those shared ways of being are not there, and people are doing things differently. And then we come to really see how it is that our worlds are built up out of these cultural materials. The final one that I want to talk about is social interactions. You can think about this as kind of patterns of communication, of engagement with one another. And what's really important about this is that these become, for those who really focus on interactions, they become places where we define and enact our ideas about the world and create meaning. And this is a central part of understanding an interactionist perspective, is that social interactions become spaces in which we create, we craft, we socially construct shared meanings of the world. And we can enact cultures, but we can also create those cultures that way. And this really enables us to see how it is that these four can be interconnected with one another. The way that culture gets enacted in interactions, the way that social networks shape who interacts with whom, the way that institutions define how interactions can take place. But for now, these are four ways of thinking about social structure. And sociologists, you'll find, emphasize different ones of these. We'll put together different forms of these structure in different ways. And each of these can actually be defined in slightly different ways. But this will give us a kind of orientation to the basic forms of thinking about social structure that we can imagine, because we're going to dive into each of these in specific units so we can really flesh out what we think is going on there. And they're really important for helping us see that kind of social context around us. All right, so we'll talk to each other soon. Take care.